Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we missed last week, do we not? I don't remember. I think we missed last week because it was straight after Shavuot. So we've not had a share for 2 weeks, which means that you've had more time to revise all the materials. So that's actually an advantage. For me, I've had to remind myself of the material. We're going to pick up the Gemara on Mem Vav Omid Beit towards the bottom, 46b. And in fact, we're going to pick it up from 4 lines from the bottom, roughly 4 lines from the bottom. The third word, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda Berei Derav Shmuel Bar Shelat, Mishmei Derav. It's something we touched on last time as well. The Gemara has been talking to us about the mitzvot of Sukkah, and as it got talking about Sukkah and what applies on the first day, what applies on the other 6 days, it moved into the topic of Chutz La'aretz. And that's where it starts getting a little bit more complicated, because we know that the halachot of Chag on Chutz La'aretz are somewhat different to those in Eretz Yisrael. And we've been here a long time now, so we have to remind ourselves that there is such a concept as 2 days Yom Tov, if you want to call it that, in Chutz La'aretz. That there are 2 Seder nights, that they have 8 days, and then they have a 9th day of Simchat Torah, etc. And those differences are at source due to the problems with determining when the new moon event occurred each month. Now, of course, now we don't really have that suffix anymore, but in Chutz La'aretz, we live in Chutz La'aretz as if that suffix was still there. There's a minhag to pretend, in other words, that we're in doubt as to which is the real day of Rosh Chodesh, even though observationally, astronomically, physically, we know exactly the microsecond of Rosh Chodesh. And the situation, therefore, is as well known in Chutz La'aretz as it is in Eretz Yisrael. Nevertheless, given that thousands of years ago the new month was fixed by observation of the moon, and it took time for that observation of the new moon to reach distances far away from Yerushalayim, in Chutz La'aretz they used to keep 2 days always out of Sofik, which means every Chag, even though they would assume nominally that it was the first day of Pesach at a certain date, they were not terribly sure. It could actually be the next day, which was really the first day of Pesach, because maybe Rosh Chodesh turned out 14 days ago to have been a day later. And because they wouldn't know by that time, they would keep 2 days. And that ambiguity, therefore, follows all the way through the Chag. It means that for a Chag on the 3rd day, when they're celebrating day 3, they're really saying to themselves, this is day 3, but it may actually only be day 2. And therefore, and that's something that's come through the Nusach of the Musaf, where in Chutz La'aretz you say, Vayom HaShlishi, Vayom HaRevi'i, Vayom Revi'i, Vayom HaMishi. It's very strange. That's because there is what's this idea of Safek. We're not really sure which day it is, but we'll carry on living as if we really knew. In Eretz Yisrael, it was always assumed that you'd know straight away which was Rosh Chodesh, and therefore when you start counting, you know exactly which is the first day of Pesach, you know which is the 14th of Nisan, you know which is the 15th of Nisan, you know when they announced Rosh Chodesh. But in Chutz La'aretz, you didn't know. And as I say, that has been carried through. And that has consequences. Even after the calendar is fixed and we all knew, given that the minhag prevails, it has halachic consequences. And we're going to come back to that in the Gemara that we're going to start today. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Berei Derav Shmuel Bar Shelat, Mishmei Derav. There's going to be a machloket here between Rav and Rav Yochanan on how you figure with this safek, whether you call it a real safek, a real doubt, or just a pretended doubt, if you like, because we're carrying on in this way as if they were a doubt in Chutz La'aretz. The Gemara asks the following question, and remember we're dealing with Talmud Bavli. If we're dealing with Talmud Yerushalmi, it probably would not be a question of interest at all, because Talmud Yerushalmi deals with the halachot as they apply to Eretz Yisrael. But Talmud Bavli, Bovel is outside Eretz Yisrael. So even though the academies in Bovel, the main yeshivot there, were the mainstay of Torah learning in the whole world at the time, they were chutz la'aretz. And therefore, certain, all those lines of inquiry regarding Yom Tov would apply to them in Bovel. So Amar Rav Yehuda Braid, Rav Yehuda Basheres Mishmei Rav, in the name of Rav. Shmini, now you have to read this properly, and I will explain this to you in a little bit more detail. There's a somewhat tongue-twisting set of phrases over here, and you've got to know where to put the commas and the semicolons, and this is the way you have to live with the Gemara. He said, Shmini, the 8th day, in chutz la'aretz, we're assuming we're talking about chutz la'aretz, we are not talking about Eretz Yisrael now. In Bovel, for example, the 8th day, the first day is the first day they kept. The day 8 is Sofik Shvi, and it happened also to be a Sofik of Shvi. So Shemini is Sofik Shvi, as I said to you. Day 8 in chutz la'aretz, it's a Sofik, it may only be day 7. Because if Rosh Chodesh really was a day later, we would only be today on day 7, not day 8. So we don't know, or we say we don't know. How do you do the mitzvot on that day? So he says, we treat it as Shvi'i l'Sukkah. We treat it as the 7th day of Sukkot, which means it's within halachically the framework of Sukkot mitzvot. But we treat it as Shmini Livrocha. The word Livrocha here is hugely confusing. What it means is in the Nusach of Tefillah, we say, Yom Shmini Atzeres Hazeh. Shmini Atzeres, we're talking about Sukkot. Shmini Atzeres is another Nusach, another Yom Tov. We don't have the mitzvah sitting in the Sukkah anymore. We don't take Lulav and Esrog. So in chutz la'aretz, there is this, you might say, conundrum. What do you do in Shmini Atzeres? Which mitzvah do you do or do you not do? Do you make a bracha on the mitzvah you do, which maybe you shouldn't be doing at all, because it's really not the Yom Tov you think it is? So on the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres and chutz la'aretz, wherever you are, how do you deal with the mitzvah of Sukkah and Shmini Atzeres? There is a contradiction between them because they have different mitzvot. If it's really Shmini Atzeres, then we should wholeheartedly deal with it as if it were Shmini Atzeres, nothing to do with Sukkah whatsoever. And if it's really the 7th day of Sukkah, and we don't know which it is, we should abandon anything to do with Shmini Atzeres, even in the Nusach of our Tefillah, and we should just sit in the Sukkah and wave Lulav and Esrog. But what do we do? This is a crisis that we should all have had in our earlier lives in chutz la'aretz. Every 8th day, we should have been racking our brains, not knowing how to behave ourselves. But of course, we already know that there is a practice, and that practice is rather hybrid one. And we'll see how that develops here in the Talmud. The practice that we have develops from the arguments we have here in the Talmud. And Rav says we treat it as the 7th day of Sukkot as far as the Sukkah is concerned, and we'll see that this is not so clear either. In other words, there is a mitzvah of Sukkah, even though it might be the 8th day, it might really be Shmini Atzeres, there's no din of Sukkah. But we treat it as Shmini Atzeres in our Tefillah. When we bench, when we say Musaf, when we say, whatever we say Yala v'Yova, we say Yom Shmini Atzeres Hazelach, we don't say B'Yom Sukkos, even though we're going to be sitting in the Sukkah and we're contradicting ourselves. So we do a bit of both. We're Tamsan Abad at Zwei Chasanas, or whatever you want, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres in chutz la'aretz. Of course, Eretz Yisrael is very simple. We know day 8 days completely abandons the Sukkah. It's Shmini Atzeres, and Shmini Atzeres doesn't have those sorts of mitzvahs. But in chutz la'aretz, we have this hybrid behavior, which shows that we're somewhat schizophrenic. And the Gemara is going to discuss this now in a little bit more detail. But that's the opinion of Rav. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, and we're going to have a look at this in a table because in fact the words aren't so clear. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, he says, Shmini lozer or lozer. We treat it, if we take this at face value, which the Gemara doesn't, we treat it as Shmini Atzeres for everything. Now, if I gave this to you as face value, it means we would not sit in the Sukkah. We would do every non-mitzvah that we would normally do on Shmini Atzeres, no lulav, no sukkah, etc. And we would say that tefillas of Shmini Atzeres, we ignore the possibility that it's the seventh day of Sukkot. Even though there is that risk that it might be the seventh day of Sukkot, we ignore that possibility. That's how it would seem to be. But let's just go a bit further, because you'll see the Gemara doesn't quite take it as that, at least not in this rendering of the Gemara. So, and the Gemara now says, to qualify what it might have meant, Mesa, when it comes to sitting in the sukkah on that 8th day, which could really be the 7th day, and therefore could really be a day for sitting in the sukkahs, but it could be the 8th day, which means we should not sit in the sukkah. Mesa, as far as sitting is concerned, kuli alma lo pligi dios vina. It's not really our practice. Everyone agrees that we do sit in the sukkah. They're not arguing whether you sit. Ki pligi, where is there a machlokus between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan? Levruchi, only whether you make a brocha of leishev basukah, not whether you sit in the sukkah. Then there's going to be a machlokus between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Lamam da'amar shvi'i lesukkah, according to the one who holds that's Rav, who holds it shvi'i lesukkah. You sit and bruchi name mevarchina. You even make your normal bracha of leishev basukah, even though there's a risk it might be Shmini Atzeres and there is no need to sit in the sukkah. In fact, it's a contradiction. You might even say Baal Tosef. But Lamal Da'omar, the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who says Shmini lozer or lozer, that is treated entirely as if it were known to be Shmini Atzeres, Bruchi lo mevarchina, you still sit in the sukkah, but you don't make a bracha. So the only difference between these two opinions is whether you make a bracha when you sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So let me just share my screen with you to crystallize that. There's a suffix, as I haven't shared it to you because I've done the wrong naughty thing, which I've done before. Let me go back again. Unless I do share screen, everything else is irrelevant. Right. Now I've shared screen. So where we have a suffix, which day is Rosh Chodesh and Chutz La'aretz, what are the consequences? Well, in Eretz Yisrael, there are no consequences. See, this is my table on the top line. We haven't got a suffix. So day 7, when we count the 7th day, it is definitely day 7 of Sukkot. Day 8 is definitely Shemini Atzeres, and indeed we've added Simchas Torah to it just to complicate things in Eretz Yisrael. That Simchas Torah is a bit of a red herring. It's got nothing to do with any of the psukim. But that's what we do. And day 9 is a weekday, Yisroel Chai, if you like. But in Chutz La'aretz, this is where all the action is and where our discussion now centers. In Chutz La'aretz, if you like, I just add day 7 as an example. Day 7, the 7th day from when we started, could actually be real day 7 of Sukkot, or it might actually be day 6 of Sukkot. Well, it doesn't really matter too much, really, which one it is. There's a din of Sukkah on both of them. But on day 8, which is what we call, even in Chutz La'aretz, Shmini Atzeres, it could be actually Shemini Atzeres, the 8th day, but it could also actually be, depending on when Rosh Chodesh really fell, and we don't know, only the 7th day of Sukkot, and that's why you have different mitzvot that apply. And day 9 is Simchat Torah and Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so this is the reality of the doubt. And here we have a machlokas Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, which I've set out over here, the opinion. What do you do in day 8 when we have this ambiguity as to whether it really is in Chutz La'aretz the 8th day, or is it the 7th day? So we have Rav, the opinion that we saw first. And what about sitting in Sukkah? Yes. And you even with bracha, which means even with making a bracha. Now that's the surprising thing. According to Rav, it could really be Shmini Atzeres and not Sukkot at all. And yet, not only do you sit in the Sukkah, but you also make a bracha. Could be a bracha levatala, surely. Isn't that an affront? Isn't that a possible bracha levatala? Isn't it an affront to the possibility of maybe Shmini Atzeres? If Hashem says it's a Shmini Atzeres today, and it really is, which means there's no din of sukkah, and I sit in the sukkah and make a bracha, does that make me a good Jew? And yet, according to Rav, that's exactly what you do. Now, we don't follow him in halacha as well. He holds that nevertheless, because there's that suffix, you still can make a bracha. As far as the text of Tefillah, Shmini Atzeres, the 8th day, you treat as Shmini Atzeres. You don't say today, Nyali V'Yovel, when you add it in your benching. Today is the Yom Shmini Atzeres Hazer, oh, Ulai Yom Shvi Shel Sukkos Hazer. Why not? There's a doubt, but you don't. You stick to the single text, even though you sit in the sukkah with a bracha, because it might be sukkah. So this is, as I said to you, very, very self-contradictory. But this is Rav's opinion. Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is a little bit easier to understand, but not that much more. Certainly, as far as the 8th day is concerned, you have the text of Shmini Atzeres. But he says you still sit in the sukkah. The only difference between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is whether you make that bracha. But he says without a bracha. You sit without a bracha. Now, the Gemara is going to say later on, the halachas like Rabbi Yochanan, that we sit in the sukkah, but without a bracha on the 8th day in Chutz La'aretz. Why? That leads to all sorts of questions, which we'll deal with. One is, for example, why should you sit in the sukkah at all? If you're going to say Shmini Atzeres Hazer Lochem in your tefillah, why sit in the sukkah? If it's not sukkahs and you're sitting in the sukkah, does it not look like Baal Tosef? There's an aveira about adding extra mitzvahs to Torah, not there. If yesterday was really the last day of sukkahs, and today really is Shmini Atzeres and I sit in the sukkah, there's a risk that I'm doing an aveira and I'm violating a lo sasem in Torah. Wouldn't it be safer not to sit in the sukkah under those circumstances? Then I might be missing out on an assay. But it's more serious to violate a negative. Why are we taking this risk of sitting in the sukkah? We'll see a little bit later why we do this. And the second question you ask yourself, the practice of Chutz La'aretz is hugely, hugely problematic. That's the point I'm making out over here, even though we're so used to it. The second thing is, if we sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, but without a bracha, let's say we follow Rabbi Yochanan, why don't we take lulav and esrog on Shmini Atzeres without a bracha? Do the same thing. Where's symmetry gone? You've thrown all this away. Where's consistency? There are two types of mitzvah for sukkah. One is lulav and esrog, and the other one's sitting in the sukkah. So, okay, we're going to sit in the sukkah just in case it's the 7th day, Shmini Atzeres. So we should take lulav and esrog without, what's wrong? Pick it up off the table, rattle it around, maybe not even say take it with Hallel, but there's a risk it's really the 7th day of Sukkah, and that's why we're sitting in the sukkahs. In the sukkah, why shouldn't we take lulav and esrog as well? Big problem. We seem to be falling into all sorts of traps over here and trying to find a happy medium, and this does not seem to be a consistent resolution. We'll have to see. But before we do see, let's just go on a bit further in the Gemara, before we answer some of those questions. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Yosef. So I'm on the 3rd line, actually, on Men Zayin and Aleph, if you've turned over to the new sheet or the new page. Amar Rav Yosef. Said Rav Yosef is going to now make a halacha. He sees that we have this machlokus between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. So what do we do in practice, he says? We are now in Bovel. Should we sit in the sukkah with a bracha or without a bracha? Everything else is agreed between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, but that's the only contest that's left over here. Do we make a bracha or do we not? So Amar Rabbi Yosef, Nakos to Rabbi Yochanan biyodecha. It's a little expression you see sometimes. Hold Rabbi Yochanan's view in your hand. In other words, grip it tightly, which means this is the halacha. The Rav Huna, that means that Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is the halacha. That you sit in the sukkah, but you don't have the chutzpah to make a bracha. After all, it could be Shmini Atzeres. So you don't make a bracha, but sit in the sukkah. What's it so terrible to sit in the sukkah? You can sit on a park bench, so sit in the sukkah if you like. That's really what he's saying. Sit in the sukkah for your meals on Shmini Atzeres, but don't make a bracha. That's what he's saying. How do I know that that's the halacha? Says Rabbi Yosef is going to prove that this is the halacha, that this is the standard practice. What's his proof? It's a strange proof. The Rav Huna bar Bizna, 1 second. I'll just stop sharing for a moment and I'll come back to that so it doesn't stare at you. The Rabbi Huda bar Bizna, V'chol Gedoli Hador. This Amora, Rav Huna bar Bizna, it's not the normal Rav Huna. There are a lot of Rav Hunas in the Gemara, very famous Amora and Rosh Hashiva, but there are a number of Rav Hunas. This is Rav Huna bar Bizna, and all his Gedoli Hador, those greatest sages of his generation, possibly about the 3rd, 4th century in the Common Era, in Bovel, Iklu Basuka Bashmini, they were observed. This is a testimony. They all used to go into the sukkah, maybe even together, maybe they had a grand sukkah party, I don't know. And they did this on the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres. And we're talking about Bovel, which is Chutz La'aretz, the same as the States or the UK as far as the halacha is concerned, on the Shmini, which is after all Sofek Shvi. It could really be the 7th day of Sukkot. And what did they do? Mesav Havayosfi, they sat in the sukkah, but Bruchi Lo Borichi, but they did not make a bracha. So Rav Yosef has said, look, if we need to know what practice to adopt, we know that Rav Huna bar Bizna and all his colleagues, now there didn't seem to be that people were doing different things. I think that's the point of the Gemara over here. They all entered into the sukkah. We saw them entering the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres and Chutz La'aretz, and they did not make a bracha. So clearly they hold like Rabbi Yochanan, which is that you sit in the sukkah on the 8th day, but you don't make a bracha. That's the sort of compromise that they've agreed to do. And that's a proof that we should adopt the halacha of Rabbi Yochanan, that we don't make a bracha. Now, the Gemara actually is going to challenge the proof here. It's going to make an attempt to say, well, maybe you haven't taken another factor into account. So let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, no. How do you know just because you saw them entering into the sukkah on the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres, and you know they didn't make a bracha? Let's assume they didn't make a bracha. But how do you know it's because they hold you don't make a bracha for the 8th day? It could be that they have an opinion in a different area of halacha, which precluded them from saying a bracha. And what's that? This is something we met as a machlokas a few weeks or even months ago. B'dilma seviralim, maybe all these rabbis who we saw not making a bracha on the 8th day, they all hold, according to the opinion, Commander Omar, Kivan Shebeirach, Yom Tov Rishon, Shuveni Mavarech. I remember, if you remember, we actually had a machlokas that came up several weeks ago. Again, this is something we don't do, but there was an opinion that when it comes to Sukkah, when you make a bracha on the first night that you enter into your Sukkah, that bracha should last you for all the days of Sukkot, all 7 official days of Sukkot. Even in Eretz Yisrael, you should never have to make another bracha. Why? If you remember, it's because since you have a bracha of sitting in the Sukkah, and the mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah is something which is a continuous mitzvah, it applies both day and by night. All 7 days could be considered one long kiyum of the mitzvah, right? You might fall asleep in between, but so what? The bracha that you do before you start that mitzvah should last you all the way through. Now, we don't hold that. Of course, we make multiple brachas in practice, but this was an opinion expressed by sages. And it is a genuine opinion to listen to, even though we don't pass in that way. So as the Gemara said, Rav Yosef has just said he can see that the halachas like Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because these sages entered into the sukkah on the 8th day and they didn't make a bracha. So you can see you don't make a bracha on the 8th day. It's not a proof. Supposing all these sages held, and this is a bit far-fetched, they all hold like that opinion that says when you make a bracha on the first night, you never need to make another bracha. Well, that's the reason they didn't make a bracha on the 8th day, because they made a bracha they never made a bracha on the 7th day, the 2nd day, the 3rd day, the 4th day either. They just weren't observed. So when you see they don't make a bracha on the 8th day, it doesn't prove that they hold in principle that the 8th day you don't make a bracha. It may be they hold, according to this strange view, that when you've made your first bracha, it lasts you all the way through. And it's got nothing to do with the sofek or not the sofek. That's what the Gemara is asking over here. You have to demonstrate proof And this is not a proof. This observation isn't a proof that they're of the opinion that on the 8th day there isn't the need to make a bracha. Because there we're talking about according to the opinion that you make a bracha every day. But if you have this deviant opinion that you only make one on the first day, you wouldn't make it either on the second or the third or the fourth. It's got nothing to do with Shmini Atzeres or anything else. So that's what the Gemara says. You haven't proven this at all, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan. If the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, if you do make regular brachas, then the only day you won't make a bracha is Shmini Atzeres. And the Gemara now gives an answer which is startling to try and explain why this. I would just have dismissed the question to say, you know, well, don't ask me silly questions. Unlikely. First of all, this is a minority opinion that you only make a bracha on the first night, not at all. And now also we're dealing with a whole large number of the Gedolei Hador and Rabbanim to say they all hold to that opinion and that, you know, it's far-fetched. I would just have dismissed it. But the Gemara instead makes a very, very strange excuse for this not being the case. And that it's impossible to say that the reason they didn't make a bracha was because they hold that they made a bracha on the first night, and that lasts them all the way through. That is not possible. Why not? Because the Gemara says, Gemiri, we have a tradition, Dime Afor Asu, that these rabbis, when they entered into the sukkah on the 8th day, they emerged out of the open pasture fields. Does that answer the question? What does that mean? So the way it's understood, certainly the way it's understood by the Mefarshim, is that we have a tradition that these rabbis, all of them, that is Rav Bizna, Rav Huna bar Bizna, and all his colleagues, they were never at home at all during Sukkot. They were out in the wilds in the forest, and they never had a sukkah all 7 days of Sukkot. There was no first night that they could have made a bracha. There wasn't even a second night. They could not build a booth at all. The first opportunity they had, these rabbis, to celebrate sitting in the sukkah was on this 8th day. So you cannot say the reason they didn't make a bracha is because they had one the first night. They were anusim. Force majeure prevented them from sitting in the sukkah. We'll see why that might be the case in a moment. And therefore, when they came on the 8th, they certainly should have said a bracha. The only reason and excuse they have for not making a bracha on the 8th day is that they hold that the 8th day is a suffix, the 7th, and you don't make a bracha because it could be Shmini Atzeres. That proves like Rabbi Yochanan. But it was never possible for them to have made a bracha earlier on. They came out of the field. So what is it? So the simply to say that they decided for one reason or another they were going to stay out in the forest for 7 days. I mean, it's possible. Remember, we did come across some certain people who are patur from the mitzvah of sukkah. Right? If you're traveling, if you're on a main mission to Rome to plead with the Romans, you can't build a booth. You're on a ship and you can't build it, and you're on a long journey. You're on a shlichus dvar mitzvah. There may be all sorts of things. You're looking after a sick person, and you're in a place where you're inside a large building. You can't build a sukkah. You don't build a sukkah. So you could well say that people in that situation might even only have the first opportunity to sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. Possible. What about these 8? What are we saying about them? They certainly didn't decide through their own discretion to go on a hike all those days, and just come out of the hike, these Gedolim, on Shmini Atzeres. That would be ludicrous. So all the Mefarshim say that the only way you can explain is to say that this was a Zman Sakana. There was a period, and there were many periods in Jewish history, when it was impossible for Jews to be Mekayim mitzvahs openly. And building a sukkah or sitting in a sukkah, changing a roof and whatever it happens to be, is something that's very difficult to do. It's very noticeable. Well, like something you do at home. You can put your tefillin on quietly or something. You can't really sit in a sukkah, certainly not in the old days, quietly, because you had to make your homes were visible, very much more visible, even than they are today. So if there were those who were going to hunt you down because you kept mitzvah, you're in trouble. So the theory is that these 7, It's a bit like the story of Maser Eliezer, etc. in Haggadah. What they were doing in Rabbi Akiva's place, they were trying, because the Bar Kokhba war was on. This is some of the theory behind some of the passages in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Anyway, over here, they were unable to keep the mitzvah for the first 7 days for that reason. The first opportunity, however, it was made available to them to sit in the sukkah was on the 8th day. And on that 8th day, we saw they didn't make a bracha. That proves you don't have to make a bracha because it's a soft 7th. So for the 8th, you don't have to make a bracha. That's what the Gemara wants to say over here. And just to share something with you, just share screen again. The Mefarshim point out that earlier on, there is another Gemara that talks about a time of danger on Sukkot. Just to give you a bit of context, it's not the same case at all. It is certainly not the same case. And in fact, this is a much earlier time. The Gemara said, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and I'm reading this passage over here. Maasa, it once happened, Bish'as HaSakana, at a time of sakana to Jewish people when they were trying to observe mitzvahs. And this could even have been in Eretz Yisrael. Shehevianu Nesorim, that we brought boards, planks. We'll see what this has got to do with in a moment. Shahoyu ben Arba, which were Arba 4 tfachim, or I think it's 4 tfachim, 4 tfachim wide, planks of wood. V'sikachnu al gabei mirpeset, and we boarded them over our balconies, if you like. V'yoshavnu tachteihen, and we sat underneath them. Now, what is he trying to say there? This was to do with another discussion. The Gemara then was discussing what is eligible material to use as schach. And you can use wood, but the Gemara said if you use sort of industrial size pieces of wood, that's not valid. Why? In other words, real proper planks of wood, because it looks as though you're building a permanent house. You remember we said that it should be a place which is a temporary rather than a permanent. You don't build metal sukkot over, or a metal roof over your and put nails in and things like that. Those things you shouldn't do over your roof to make it look permanent. And there was a regulation earlier on that if you take boards, planks of wood, and plank over your balcony to create a roof, and they're as wide as 4 tfachim, that already crosses the line into being, if you like, permanent, and that's invalid as a sukkah kafri. So Rabbi Yehuda said in that context, but it happened once at a time of sakana that we did use planks that were 4 wide, and we covered them over, and on sukkahs we sat underneath them. So what are you trying to say? That you can't use such boards? We did it once. And so Amrulo, the sages said to Rabbi Yehuda, and this is also interesting, Misham Raya, are you going to bring a proof from the case that you used to use boards 4 wide at a time of sakana? Ein sha'as ha-sakana ra'aya. A time of sakana is not a raya. So on a different level, that's an important principle over here, that sometimes things are allowed at a time of sakana, which are halachically incorrect. The fact that you did it at a time of sakana and it was permitted and nobody complained was simply because there ain't breira, that's the only thing you had that you were going to get away with, and you did it. But, the commentaries explain, you really were not mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah on that occasion. You know what you were mekayim? What did you fulfill? You fulfilled something like zeicha l'sukkah, a commemoration of sitting in the sukkah. Also valuable. We find this elsewhere as well. Under certain circumstances, if you can't do a certain mitzvah, you're not going to do the mitzvah, and it's an onus. However, if you do something that looks similar already, it's as if you were trying to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I would love to perform this mitzvah correctly and properly, but I can't. And just to show how dedicated I am to the mitzvah, I'm going to pick up the seaweed instead. And we don't normally do that. You don't have a lulu, pick up some seaweed or something. But if you were to do that and have good kavanah, there's nothing wrong. You're not going to make a bracha over it. And over here, even though the 4 tfachim really means it was an invalid sukkah, at a time of sakana, you can do certain things. And even though they're invalid, it might be better doing those things commemoratively than doing nothing at all. That's what the Gemara says over here. I only brought this to show you that all sorts of mitzvot, so to speak, were endangered by the environment, by the people, the nations around, the governing bodies, the authorities. And there's already an earlier Gemara about times of danger. So the Gemara is saying, as far as we were concerned, in our Gemara over here, that these sages had been away. They hadn't been able to carry out mitzvah sukkah at all. And the first they were seen in the sukkah was the 8th day, and they didn't make a bracha. That shows they hold like the Rabbi Yochanan, which is you sit in the sukkah, but you don't make a bracha on this Shmini Atzeres, which is essentially what we do as well. Now, I'm just going to skip a few lines because the Gemara's got an Ikad Omri, which means there's another version of Gemara, which comes out with the same conclusion anyway, and it's only going to confuse us. So I'm going to leave out a few lines to make it easier so we go on. Instead of going on to Ikad Omri, which is one now, I'm going to skip something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines or 6 lines, and we'll commence again, or 7 lines, to the beginning of the line, the Hilchasa. The Hilchasa. So it's a number of lines further down, beginning of the line there. The Gemara says here that the halacha is Mesev Yasvini. This is the final halacha that's brought in Shulchan Aruch, if you like. Mesev Yasvinon. We sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, which is really a suffix of the 7th day, and Chutz Loretz. But Bruchi Lema Barchima, but we don't make a bracha. Eretz Yisrael, we don't sit at all in the sukkah because we're 100% sure the 8th day is Shmini Atzeres in this moment through sukkah. But in Chutz Loretz, because of that risk, we sort of do a bit and we don't do the other bits. So now let's just think what the problems were again, just before we go further in the Gemara, we talks a bit more about Shmini Atzeres. Where does that leave us as far as the mitzvahs, the sfeikus and the problems that we raised earlier on about doing things inconsistently on Shmini Atzeres? So, but what about the problem of Baal Tosef? We're sitting in the sukkah. It may be Shmini Atzeres. You're not supposed to add extra days to the Yom Tov. And if we sit in the sukkah, and essentially, we are making that 8th day, or shall we say, we're certainly expressing the view that we consider that day to be Sukkot. Hey, it isn't, it's Shmini Atzeres, so we've added an extra day to Sukkot. Now, we don't know if it's Shmini Atzeres, but there's a risk that we're doing that, and we're violating the principle of not adding to the days of Yom Tov or adding mitzvahs, all sorts of things. You don't have 5 parshas in your tefillin, you don't add days of Yom Tov that aren't there. You don't take 5 minim instead of 4 minim. It would all be Baal Tosef. And over here, you're adding another day to Sukkot. Are you not doing that? Or we say not a risk you're doing that? So here, all the commentaries have to answer these questions because they're very serious questions. And one of the major answers is that at least if we come back to Eretz Yisrael for a moment, and we'll then have to talk about not just Eretz Yisrael, the Middle East. Let's talk about the Middle East. Don't forget over here, the question was asked in relation to Bavel. It wasn't asked in relation to Glasgow in Scotland. It was, there were no Tanoim or Amoraim in Europe at the time. That's much later on. So it was asked in Bavel. Bavel has a hot climate, even hotter than Eretz Yisrael. So the answer given is, you know what? There isn't really a risk of the violation of Baal Tosef if you sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. After all, on a hot day, you might choose quite frequently to sit outside in your garden. No one says, oh, you've got to be in the house, it's Yom Tov today. Or you could choose to, be in a hotel. You could choose to have your meals near the swimming pool, as long as it was, tsanua, in a hotel. No one says you've got to be in a particular environment. You're in an environment that you think suits you for your particular meal. Therefore, to sit in the sukkah on the 8th day isn't going to be a violation of Baal Tosef, because you can excuse yourself on the basis that I'm sitting in the sukkah, not because it could be the 7th day of Sukkot, but because, on a pleasant day like this, the wind rustling through the leaves above me, it seems very nice. Let's assume it is very nice. It may not always be very nice, but that's the excuse we make. So it's not Baal Tosef. It doesn't look as though you've gone and done something completely absurd. because people do sit, and certainly it was true in the old days, people didn't have apartments, and stuff like that. So they all lived not far away from a bit of greenery or whatever it is. So they'll sit under the sukkah rather than under the rafters of their house, which is probably not much more comfortable at that time anyway in Bovel. They weren't living in palaces. So that's why it wasn't a flagrant violation of Baal Tosef. And that, by the way, would explain why it is that for many of us in Europe and North America, we don't have the minhag of eating or sitting in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. There are a few people who do, but a lot of people actually make Kiddush on the night of Shmini Atzeres and go straight back in. They do not follow this Gemara. And we just said this was the halacha. They don't sit in the sukkah, or they make Kiddush in the morning and immediately go in. Now, that's not the halacha here. The halacha over here is that you sit in the sukkah all day, essentially the same way as you would do on the first day of sukkah and second day of sukkah. You just don't make a bracha. We, in most places, don't. So one of the excuses we give is that, you know what, the way Jewry developed after the time of the Gaonim was to move into Europe. In Europe, the climate is colder. And therefore, for us to deliberately move out of our houses and sit in the sukkah on the 8th day, which could be the 7th day, but the point is that there's a real risk of being flagrantly violating Baal Tosef. Because you can't say, well, you know what, to me it makes no difference whether I'm sitting in the sukkah or whether I'm sitting in the home, because you've got your anorak on, 3 scarves, your gloves and everything else. It does not look proper. It does not look as though this is where you would like to be. Now, of course, some of us are very comfortable sukkahs as well, and then you might suddenly say you should sit in the sukkah all day. But that's an excuse given for why we have changed that minhag in large numbers. Even though that's an excuse that's given, it's a very unsatisfactory excuse, because Jews have been in all sorts of warm places. California, you can't, otherwise in California, people would also sit in the sukkah differently. You should be doing things according to the climate zone you're in. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, then you certainly don't. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, then you should. If you're in the Equatorial, we don't make those distinctions. So what seems to have, there are other medrashim, and there are other kabbalot that people have had, in which contradict this Gemara, that say you sit in the sukkah, and they actually hold one shouldn't, even in principle, sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And this has gone quite a long way with some Hasidic circles as well, where it's almost, you get an electric shock if you sit in the sukkah, on the 7th day of sukkah. They think, well, you're a yekker or something like that. What are you doing? So there are groups of people who are really quite against sitting in the sukkah and Shmini Atzeres, and I don't think it's to do with the climate at all. So there's some strange things that go on over here. Some of them are traditional, some are based upon Kabbalah. I think there was a Medrash Tanchuma that says you don't sit in the sukkah. There are some other sources that don't fall in with this Gemara. Normally we paskin like Talmud Bavli, and not like some far-fetched medrash somewhere. But somehow, some of the slightly more far-fetched practices have crept in and almost taken over, and we're having to make excuses for what we nowadays do, which is very much to avoid the sukkah, most of us, on Shmini Atzeres. Second question we left, maybe we can understand this difference, why we do, why we don't, why it's not a violation of Hutzlaritz. Why it's not a violation in Bovel, but it might be a violation of Hutzlaritz. So we talked about that. What about the Arba Minim? If we're going to sit in the sukkah without a bracha, because why shouldn't we on Shmini Atzeres? Why don't we take the Arba Minim? Is it painful? We're going to get a splinter or something? Why shouldn't we do the same? Pick up the Arba Minim. They're very nice to look at. It's nice to hold. Just wiggle them around a few times and put them down on the table. You lost anything? If it really is the 7th day of Sukkot, I've just been Makai my mitzvah. You don't need a bracha to be Makai mitzvah. Be very careful. You don't need a bracha. I've been Makai my mitzvah just by picking it up. And if it's Shmini Atzeres, what harm have I done? On Shmini Atzeres, can't I walk around the house and pick up a vase, or move my plates around or my pillows around? You don't say, oh, we don't do this. What's wrong with picking up a lulav and esrog? So there are various answers given to that. One answer is that maybe you could say that if it wasn't Shmini Atzeres, if it is Shmini Atzeres on this doubtful 8th day equals 7th day conundrum, then maybe the lulav and esrog are muktzah, right? It's something, a pillow you do pick up. because you're allowed to. Who says you should pick up a strange plant? Would you pick up a cactus? Probably not. So maybe the lulav and esrog would be potentially muktzah because it could be Shmini Atzeres. And therefore, even though it's a suffix, it's the seventh day, a contradiction again. We really don't know which way to turn. We'd rather not touch muktzah. We leave it alone. We may be losing out on something, but we don't want to touch muktzah. And another possibility, which is something we compare a little bit to the sukkah. I said to you that in Bovel, at least, to sit in the sukkah on a hot climate, it's not a flagrant act of Baal Tosef adding another day to the Yom Tov. Because anyway, maybe even on any day of the year, they might sit under that sort of shelter because you fancy it. So it doesn't necessarily prove you're treating it like sukkahs. You can't say the same, really, if you were to pick up a lulav and esrog on the 8th day, even if it were not muktzah, and you say, well, I'm not doing any harm, because it's it's just an ordinary, it's not muktzah, and I could pick up anything else, and this is the same. There might be a violation of Baal Tosef here, much more obviously, a bit like sitting in the sukkah in Chutz La'aretz where it's cold and saying, oh, I like to sit in the sukkah in the cold weather outside. Why? Because there's no earthly reason, there's no rationale you can give, unlike sitting in the sukkah on a warm day. In Bovel, you can't give a similar rationale for picking up lulav and esrog. The only rationale you can possibly ascribe is it could be sukkahs. But it may not be. In that case, you could be violating Baal Tosef. If you had an alternative rationale which said, but anyway, I usually pick up greenery on Shmini Atzeres or any day of the year, and I'm only doing the same, then you get away with it. But we don't. I mean, specifically the lulav and esrog, which is the only time of the year you're interested in them on sukkahs. And now one day later you pick it up again to say, well, I'm only picking it up because I like to, but not because of the mitzvah of sukkah. You can't say that. It's clearly because you're extending sukkahs into Shmini Atzeres. But it may really be Shmini Atzeres. That would be a violation of Baal Tosef, and therefore you don't. Which explains why we don't take lulav and esrog on the 8th day, even though we sit in the sukkah without a bracha. Okay. All right, so that takes us really away from this Gemara of what you do on Shmini Atzeres in Chutz La'aretz, as far as sitting in the sukkah, making a bracha, not making a bracha. It's interesting material, particularly because you see that somehow we've made some unpleasant compromises over here. As you know, it's we've mixed and matched over here to try and give expression to both. Give expression to the fact that Shmini Atzeres, we say by Yom HaShmini Atzeres Hazeh. To give expression, it might be the 7th day of Sukkot. We give expression by sitting in the sukkah, or pretending, though, that we like it anyway, and sitting in the sukkah, but not doing so in such a brazen way that it would conflict with Baal Tosef. So we don't pick up the lulav and esrog. So you can see how carefully we're treading on eggshells, and what has become the minhag and Chutz La'aretz and Shmini Atzeres is based upon this constant dance between is it Shmini Atzeres and is it Sukkot? We don't have that dance over here. It's very clear. Demarcation is very clear. And by the way, that has other consequences. In Eretz Yisrael, Shmini Atzeres is holy Shmini Atzeres, and there's no sitting in the sukkah. It has other consequences in terms of Bnei Chutz La'aretz. You know, when Bnei Chutz La'aretz come to Eretz Yisrael, and they inundate the local neighborhood and set up their sukkot everywhere. And sometimes you hear more sukkah celebrations, on the day after sukkahs than you do, you have, just like they have sukkahs Torah day long and everything else. So many of them, they sit in the sukkah, of course, on Shmini Atzeres, or these many of them may well want to, or make kiddush in the sukkah or whatever it is. And here they're advised to do so very quietly or not at all, because it's a contradiction. We treat it entirely as Shmini Atzeres, and they're trying to do their halfway house, whatever it is, to make kiddush or maybe to have a meal, sit without a bracha, and that's that is brazenly contradicting the minhag of Eretz Yisrael. So they have got a minhag, and maybe if their minhag is to sit in the sukkah, that's fine, but they shouldn't do so openly, in the same way as people shouldn't do other things openly here in Eretz Yisrael, which are against the minhag of Eretz Yisrael. Even if they have their minhag privately at home, for example, a well-known example of that is men who put on their tefillin during Chol HaMoed. It's very widespread, certainly in Yerushalayim. Meaning Hadra has been adopted almost everywhere, that in Eretz Yisrael you don't put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And yet in Chutz La'aretz, many communities do. They put on tefillin. Now, the Hasidim don't, but many other tefillin communities put on tefillin during Chol HaMoed, and there's nothing more to it. They put on tefillin the normal way on Chol HaMoed. When they come to Eretz Yisrael, if you anywhere in Israeli shul, you get thrown out if you put your tefillin on. It's considered to be a complete contradiction to the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael to maintain your minhag publicly. And what you should do is you daven in shul, and then go home and lay tefillin at home where nobody sees you. Yeah, again, you shouldn't take your tefillin to the. I think one of the Gedolim saw someone put on tefillin at a kotel during Chol HaMoed. Oh, did this guy get a talking to? I mean, how can you do this at the kotel? I mean, you can go home and put on tefillin, but you don't put your tefillin on the Chol HaMoed. It's a contradiction with the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. When we know the calendar, and also we have minhagim which are fixed to ourselves, and the minhag of the Gra is almost universal. We're now going to be talking about Shechianu. When do you say Shechianu on a new Yom Tov? Now, why this is interesting really is because it takes us to the question of what is Shmini Atzeres? Is it a separate Yom Tov? Remember, again, this is another subject. Sukkot altogether is full of interesting stuff, that we don't always think about in great detail until we look at the details of halachas. That it's the 8th day. Let's take Eretz Yisrael. Ignore Golas completely. The principle: 7 days of Sukkot, and the last day it says Bayom Hashmini. The pasuk says Atzeres Tiyeh Lachem. It will be in Atzeres. And it says, Kol Molechas Avoda Lo Sasu, but it doesn't give you any mitzvahs. What is an Atzeres? Shmini Atzeres. Atzeres means holding back. All sorts of like pshatlach, what that really means. Or it can mean a congregational get-together. It's difficult to know exactly what it means. Holding back is the best word. La'atzor means to stop. What are we holding back? We're holding back the departure of Yom Tov by another day, if you're thinking about it. It's a delay to our return to daily activities. But it's not a day of Sukkot. It doesn't say B'yom Hashmini Sukkot Yiyeh Lachem. We said Shivas Yomim. That's the end of Sukkot. And then we move directly into another Yom Tov, which has no mitzvahs really, other than a name. And it's called Atzeres. And we change as we say, we have this question. We know the Sukkot mitzvahs don't normally apply, and we had all this question, Chutz La'aretz, with the ambiguity of the date. But what is it? Is it really a separate Yom Tov? If you were making a Shechianu on the first night, does that take you all the way through to the end of the 8th? Or do we say Sukkot has ended, we now come into a completely separate Chag? So let's see, the Gemara is going to be discussing this. When do we define a festival as being separate? What about the 7th day of Pesach? 7th day of Pesach we know is another Yom Tov. Do we say, because we've had Chol HaMoed in between, that the 7th day, let me change my language. The 7th day of Yom Tov is also Yom Tov, not it's another Yom Tov. That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Is it another Yom Tov? Or is it just a continuation of Pesach? And it's just on the last day, there is a transgression on work. There is a prohibition against work. Is Shemini Atzeres the same, really? It's just a bookend of the beginning of Sukkot, or is it entirely separate? So here we will see some of those distinctions come up. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Omrim Zaman. What is Zaman? Zaman means Shechianu. The bracha Shechianu is referred to in the Talmud as Zaman because it commemorates a new, if you like, era or a new time period, the time period of a new Chag. The time has reached to do something commemorative in a different way. The end of the weekday, we're moving into a festival. We say Zman, we say Shechianu, Bashmini Shel Chag, on the 8th day of Sukkot, which is Shmini Atzeres. On the night we make Kiddush, we say Shechianu. Ve'ein omrim Zman b'Shvi'i Shel Pesach, but we don't make it on the 7th day of Pesach, which is the last day, and it's a Yom Tov day of Pesach. And that's this Rabbi Yochanan is telling you this. I know you may already know. If you know it, you know it because the Gemara said this over here. There is a distinction between the last day of Pesach, which is also a Yom Tov, and the last day of Sukkot, which is also a Yom Tov. But on that last day of Yom Tov on Sukkot, which is Shmini Atzeres, it's considered to be a separate Yom Tov from the first 7 days. For Amar Rabbi Levi Bar Chama, Itema Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina, Rabbi Levi Bar Chama, and some say it was Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina said, Teda, you should be convinced. I can prove to you that one says Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres, which is something you might have thought you knew anyway, but the Gemara is not so certain. I mean, it's certain enough, but only because it's going to bring proofs that Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov. Shahari Cholok Bishlosha Devarim, because it is distinct from the first day of Sukkot for the first days of Sukkot, the first 7 days, in 3 things. And they're quite obvious, really. The Sukkah, you don't sit in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. I'm talking about formally in Eretz Yisrael, not in a situation of doubt in Chutz La'aretz. There is no mitzvah of Sukkah, so that's one distinction between the 7 days and the 8th day. The Lulav, and there's no mitzvah of Lulav. The Nisuch HaMayim, and there isn't the celebration of the Nisuch HaMayim festival, where the libation of water on the Mizbeach that they did all 7 days of Sukkot. On the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, that's absent. So there are 3 distinctions between the first 7 days and the 8th day, and that is a cause enough for us to say, I mean, I'm not sure what would be cause or wouldn't be cause. It certainly seems very ample cause to say Shechianu when the 8th day comes in, because you can see very clearly that we've moved from one type of festival to another type of festival. And the Gemara goes on to say, and Rabbi Yehuda, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, to Amar Balug Hayom Menasech Kol Shmona, it's not important to know this, but Rabbi Yehuda actually holds that the Nisuch HaMayim was even done, that water libation was even done on Shmini Atzeres, which means that distinction between Shmini Atzeres and the other days of Sukkot are not there, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that particular distinction. It is, after all, still distinct from the first 7 days in 2 ways. That is, we don't take the Lulav and Esrog, and we don't sit in the Sukkah. And for that reason, we will make a separate Shechianu when Shmini Atzeres comes in. Just for a moment, the Gemara is actually going to say, well, there are differences in Pesach as well, quite interestingly. We'll get onto that now, between the first days of Pesach and the last day of Pesach. It's not so simple. And we'll see how the Gemara answers this. Why might you have thought you don't say Shechianu? I mean, isn't it obvious? We're making a difference in our Nusach. Hashmini Atzeres Hachag Hazer. The previous days, we said Yom Chag HaSukkos Hazer. Is it obvious, therefore, there's a separate Yom Tov? Do I need the Gemara to bring the obvious into our faces? So it seems you could argue they should be treated as a single Yom Tov because they are a single continuum with no days of Chol in between. And the Shmini Atzeres, therefore, is a Yom Tov which isn't broken up from the previous Yom Tov. So therefore, you could say it's not an occasion to renew. It's not a renewal occasion in the way other Yom Tovim are, right? So you say that when Shavuos comes, I make a Shechianu. And when Pesach comes, I make a Shechianu. Because we've had bags of secular days in between. And all of a sudden, we're back into Issa Melacha, etc. But there hasn't really been a difference between Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. There's been a continuum with no break in between. So you might think that the Zaman, the Shechianu you make at the first night, should last you for all 8 days. So therefore, the sages are telling you that it's not a matter of whether there's a continuum of Yom Tov. What matters is whether the Yom Tov commemorates the same things and has the same mitzvot. And if they don't have the same mitzvot, then you will not suffice to have the first Shechianu. You need to make another Shechianu. Okay, we will discuss this further in terms of the ramifications of differences in mitzvot To what extent do they bring about the need to say a new Shechiyonu? As the Gemara will argue that there is a parallel, even big difference between the first days of Pesach and the last day of Pesach, and therefore maybe you should say a Shechiyonu even on the last day of Pesach. We'll see this next time. So I'll quit recording if I remember where the stop sign is.